Thank you, Clark. With that, I'm going to have Alexis Quint come up and sing the first song of the morning, and then while we're all standing for the national anthem, we'll get in line, and Marlene and Hope will be happy to serve us all breakfast. It's up to you.
Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly wailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Okay, Lexi, lead us through the light.
That is the one I would have picked. That's why. He doesn't see that this Carry one in your
I'm sorry. And the sound is absolutely yeah. So Dawson has
Yeah, we did. I did. Grabbing it.
It was a work in progress.
well, Dawson, I think it's really awesome. Well, I can give you background information. And we're next.
Yeah, no, it's great. I bought a mic because I was like looking for a grader, but I was trying to this one. You should buy this one. Well, I use it a lot, and we got what she said. Trust me, this will change your life. She was right, and she was like, so I went back and bought one on his dad.
I called one company in California, and they said they're not even their delivery date is like 6 months before.
I haven't ordered it. Donna, thanks for letting us borrow the front yard for the video.
Yeah, she just shot a video yesterday.
Yeah, way more.
They were doing it.
I went to that
Actually, so Dawson earlier and has been recognized as the closest to Senator Norris as a legislator in Nebraska. Yep. If it was from the Vikings. Oh. Yeah. Love it. Love it. This is a pretty impressive
I want to extend another thank you to Marlene Medor and Marlene's Catering. They do an absolutely wonderful job with this breakfast. Now that we we've all been served, I am going to turn it over to Trevor Jones. I'm very excited about this speech this morning. Trevor is the director and CEO of History Nebraska, the state's historical society. He's an award-winning author of numerous articles about museum and American history. He's worked as a museum curator, exhibition designer, and an educator. We are honored to have him here in McCook today. Thank you, Trevor.
Good morning. So the title of my talk today is What Would George Norris Think About 2020? And as I noted, I work for History Nebraska, which is the state's historical society. We have the largest collection of Nebraska history in the world, and one of our historic sites that we operate around the state is the George Norris House here in McCook, who's ably run by Donna Bates, who's over here. So I'm thrilled to be back in McCook, and the reason that we do what we do and the reason that I do what I do is that we're really focused on preserving the past to build the future. So I believe that studying history is really valuable because it's only by understanding what happened before us can we truly imagine what can happen next. We need that context in order to have a vision for the future. So that's why I think history is so important for us. And 2020 is, to put it mildly, a challenging year, but it is a historic one as well. And I guarantee you that if you're lucky to live long enough, that some fourth grader in Nebraska at some point is going to be assigned to interview somebody who lived through 2020 and say, what was that like? And then they're going to have to write an essay or give a speech and report back. That's how historic this year is. And so we are going to be in the history books. This time that we are living in, it will be covered ad nauseum. There'll be all kinds of things that are about this. So people are going to look very closely at how we lived, and you can't say that about every year that you lived through, but you know that that's going to happen. So be prepared for that interview. That fourth grader's coming. They're not even born yet, but they're on their way. So 2020 is a tumultuous year, but then the United States has had a lot of unusual years, and my thinking was that Senator Norris lived through many of them. He was born in 1861 during the Civil War. It had just begun, and he died in 1944 during World War II, and he lived through all kinds of American cataclysms in between. He lived through the Panic of 1893 that people forget about, but it wiped out the savings of millions of Americans at that time. He lived through World War I, he lived through the Great Depression, and Norris had so much experience that it's really interesting to speculate about what he would think about the issues we face today in 2020. So I believe there's some really important lessons here that we can learn from considering how Norris would have approached the year. And I hope I can inspire you just to put a little tiny bit of Norris's commitment to making the world a better place into your own lives today. But I have a warning for you before I get started, and that is that Mr. Norris would have hated this topic, and he would have absolutely probably booed me off out of this room if it was announced. And I know this because in the 1930s, a reporter asked Senator Norris what Abraham Lincoln would have done if he had lived during the Great Depression. And Norris's response was, Lincoln would be just like me. He wouldn't know what the hell to do. So Norris did not feel that the great emancipator would have some sort of special knowledge about contemporary events simply because he did great work in his own time. Norris didn't believe that. He wasn't a fan of opinions. This was a man who didn't like opinions. What he liked was research. He refused to debate or sometimes even discuss an issue that he hadn't extensively researched. He didn't believe in suppose. He didn't like what if. And he hated people who speculated about stuff, especially with the media, who talked without having enough expertise. Didn't like that, didn't like it at all. And I am not an expert in all things George Norris. History Nebraska has the George Norris House here in McCook. I've read about him, but there are lots of things I don't know about George Norris. And Norris would not tolerate that. He would not be happy with me about that. And so he studied the facts first. He took his time so that he could eventually propose complete solutions to problems once he felt he fully understood them. So, with apologies to George Norris, so I apologize, George, I am still going to speculate. But I do know that he probably wouldn't like this talk, but he wouldn't spend a lot of time booing me. He'd probably just leave. He'd go up the hill to his house. He'd park himself in that chair on the first floor, and he'd start trying to fully understand 2020's problems. And then once he understood them, he'd get to work. That's the kind of man that he was. So I'm going to start with the coronavirus pandemic because to George Norris, the coronavirus pandemic and our response this year would feel pretty familiar. This would not faze him at all. Because after all, he'd lived through a terrible pandemic as well. In 1918 into 1919, Spanish influenza infected about 1/3 of the global population. Deaths worldwide at that time topped 50 million, and an estimated 650,000 Americans died. The influenza was especially terrible because it killed the very young and the very old, as the flu typically does, that very young and very old category on either end. But it also killed huge numbers of 20 to 40-year-olds that were in the prime of their life, and we still don't really know why. And that influenza was bad like today, but it was worse for medical reasons because like today there was no vaccine, but they also didn't have any ventilators. They had no antibiotics to treat secondary infections like we have today. And in 1919, what they had was quarantine and personal hygiene. That was it. And Washington, D.C. during the global pandemic in 1918-1919 was one of the worst hit places in the entire nation. And of course, Washington was where George Norris lived. So while he was in Washington, George Norris lived through the same kind of confusing and changing recommendations we ourselves have experienced over the last few months. When the first cases of the flu appeared, he was told to stay off streetcars, postpone unnecessary meetings. It was concerning, but Washington's health director announced in 1918, there is little danger that Washington, with its high degree of wholesomeness, will be the scene of a serious outbreak of the disease. Wholesomeness. But the health director was very, very wrong. It got much worse. First they closed the schools, then they banned public gatherings, churches closed, Congress closed, and then they started fining people heavily for failing to isolate. Like today, there was pressure to relax the restrictions after the worst seemed to pass in the fall of 1918. They thought things were getting better, and so they loosened restrictions, but the flu spiked again in December, and many more people died. And so by the end of the pandemic, more than 10 times the number of Americans who had died in World War I were dead from a single disease in a year. And so while Norris was going through this in Washington, things weren't really great in Nebraska either. Our state's overall death toll was reported between 2,800 and 7,500 people. And this is a broad range because Nebraska's reporting was just terrible. We were really bad at it. Medical professionals gave reasons for this. Many of them said that they had such a large number of flu patients, they had no time to keep records at all. And so what happened was that federal officials thought that Nebraska's records were so inaccurate that they didn't even use them when they calculated the total number of flu cases and deaths in the United States. So Nebraska's numbers are not even included in the history books for that. And so hopefully we're doing a better job reporting during this pandemic than we did as a state in 1918. So we have better tracking today, we have better medicines today, but most of our health recommendations right now would be very familiar to Senator Norris. In 1918, the Surgeon General of the Army published 12 rules for staying safe from influenza, and some of them are really solid and very familiar advice to us. Avoid crowds, wash your hands regularly, cover your coughs and sneezes, wear a mask. But others were just a little bit odd. So there was also chew your food well. You guys are eating breakfast, so remember that. Drink a glass of water when you wake up, first thing, glass of water. Breathe deeply, and I love this last one, avoid tight clothes. So it's an excuse for sweatpants. And I don't think the last one's really helped that much, but those really were the official recommendations for the time. So a lot of that feels very familiar. And Norris certainly knew people who died from the Spanish flu. And I think he'd be very concerned that our governmental response to COVID has not improved much over how it was in his day. Same sort of things we're doing happened then are happening now. However, I don't really think that Norris would spend too much time worrying about how we're feeling about the pandemic. Norris did care about people, but what he was really focused on were principles and policies, places where he could affect change. And if you've read his autobiography, you know that he wasn't really big on discussing his emotions. The death of his brother gets barely a line in his book, and his father's rapid and really tragic death from pneumonia in a 48-hour period when he was just a child is dismissed with the line, "Only the grief of my mother's and my sisters left an impression upon me. When I grew older, it seemed to me my father never had lived." So he wasn't big into feelings, George Norris. He was big into policy, so he wouldn't be focused on the pandemic. And so he was interested in stuff that could get changed with legislation. And he believed very strongly, as you guys know, in the wisdom of the common people. And so I've got to say that today in 2020, he'd be very dismissive of Senator Sass's recent call to repeal the 17th Amendment, which allows Americans to elect their senators directly from the ballot box instead of having them appointed by state legislatures. Norris fought really hard for the 17th Amendment for years, believing that the appointment of senators by legislatures took the power from the people and also encouraged corruption and bribery in state houses. And it's very likely he would feel exactly the same today. And on the state level, I think he'd be deeply disappointed that Nebraska still has the only unicameral in the nation. He fully expected this idea to take off and there to be unicamerals nationwide. That was his vision. And so the fact that we have only one in 2020 would bother him a lot. And I think he would also be really frustrated about the current level of partisanship in our unicameral today. He'd lament partisan bickering, and he would say that even if there's an excuse for partisanship in Washington, there is none at the state level. Norris felt that government should be a matter of sound administration and management, not ideology. And he'd remind our state senators, again, that principle matters more than party. But however bad it is today, and he wouldn't like it, partisanship was something that Norris dealt with his entire life, and he recognized it could not be legislated away. So he'd reprimand us for not doing better, but I think instead of focusing it, he'd look to solve issues that he felt were hampering what he called the progress of civilization. So he'd look around and say, what can I change that's hampering the progress of civilization? And Norris also believed very strongly in helping rural Americans. That was a big focus for him. So he'd look for something that would help rural communities as well. So progress of civilization, rural communities. And so in 2020, I think, when I really thought about this, I think there's one issue that George Norris would sink his teeth into, and that's improving access to high-speed internet. That's what he would do. And of course, the first thing we would have to do is explain to Senator Norris what the internet is. So that would be first. But I think once somebody smarter than me sat down with him and explained that, he would immediately understand the parallels between access to broadband today with access to electricity in the 1930s. And like electricity during the Great Depression, broadband is unequally distributed today, and it is passed by many rural communities. And as most of you know, Norris spent decades fighting to provide affordable access to electricity to all Americans. So in 1930, about 90% of city residents had electricity. That's pretty good, 90% in 1930. But only 10% of rural farms did. And so Nebraska's average in 1929, we were worse than that. Only 5.9% of our farmers had electricity. And Norris saw this gap as not just unfair. This is not just unfair that city people have electricity and rural people don't. But he saw it as a threat to democracy and American prosperity, that it was leaving an entire chunk of the nation behind. And so he wrote that equal access to electricity should be a right for all Americans. I knew falling water, when properly harnessed, generated electricity. Its secret, even in the electrical age, which is dawning, is but partially known and understood to science, but its service to mankind is recognized, relieving men and women of drudgery which cannot be discharged in any other way. It drives the machines of production. So today in 2020, access to broadband is much the same as access to electricity was in the 1930s. In our world today, the internet is a necessity. It is not a luxury. But unequal access to high-speed internet is still left many behind. 21.3 million Americans currently lack any broadband access. That's a pretty big number. But it gets a lot worse when you consider the huge rural and urban divide there. Only 4% of urban Americans don't have broadband accessibility. So 96%, if you live in a city, 96% of Americans have that. But for rural people, it's a whopping 31% don't have broadband. And again, like in 1929, Nebraska is worse than the national average. So last October, Nebraska's Rural Broadband Task Force estimated that 37% of rural Nebraskans lack access to high-speed broadband service that meets FCC guidelines. And frankly, if we're just talking about FCC guidelines, they're really, really stingy. You would not be happy with meeting FCC guidelines if you're trying to do a Zoom meeting or to stream video. It's not great. It's just barely, think of that as barely adequate and something that's probably going to make you annoyed. And the need to solve this problem is not new, and in fact, thinking about Norris and this issue together has been mentioned by scholars before. Maybe you guys, some of you were even here, but in 2008, Dr. Lawrence J. Malone delivered a Norris lecture at the community college right here in McCook, and it was about the power of telecommunications in rural economic development, and his talk was based on his paper, which was the REA and high-speed rural internet access. And so this isn't a new issue. But I think that in 2020, Norris would find it particularly urgent that we find a solution. So during the past months, many of us have had to change how we're doing things, including my organization, History Nebraska. We had to pivot from kids coming on site for visits to going out to them, to putting educational material out remotely. And so suddenly there's this great need for online learning for everyone. But the best numbers that I can find is that out of the country's 51 million students, 15 million of our students either have no home broadband service or they lack service that can handle the demand of an online class, such as video conferencing. So 15 out of 51 million. And up to 400,000 American teachers also lack adequate connections from where they live. And schools have been trying to cope with this, and they've been very clever. They've bought hotspots and they've handed them out. They've invited families to use their Wi-Fi in their parking lots. Some schools have even put together Wi-Fi buses that drive around to go meet students where they are and provide Wi-Fi there. And these are great innovations, really clever, but they're also, I think, very much signs of desperation for what our educators are doing. And I know this pain personally because a few years ago, I lived just 5 miles out of town. I had no high-speed internet options. I guess I could have gotten a T1 line for $1,500 a month if I was willing to do that, but that was not in our budget. And so what we did was we had to drive our kids to the local library, and we would sit in the parking lot so we could get Wi-Fi so they could submit their assignments. And that's what we did. That's what we did weekly for years. And that was before coronavirus made access to remote education essential, not really optional for most kids. And so Nebraska's Rural Broadband Task Force did a report that acknowledges the importance of high-speed access to our state's future. They wrote, rural broadband is important to Nebraska's economy and to the state's businesses, consumers, agricultural producers, students, educators, patients, and healthcare providers. Rural broadband availability and adoption are associated with attraction and retention of millennials, greater economic growth, attraction of new firms, higher household incomes, and small business growth. So this stuff's important for economic development. This is an absolutely core piece of economic development packages. And so in the 1930s, George Norris decried the fact that electrical companies passed rural people by because it was simply not profitable to provide them with that service. And the solution for him was the REA. And the Rural Electrification Act provided loans for the installation of electrical lines. It allowed the formation of cooperatives to manage them. And President Roosevelt started the program in 1935 with an executive order. And what he said was that electricity is no longer a luxury. It is a definite necessity. It lights our homes, our places of work, and our streets. It turns the wheels of most of our transportation and our factories. In our homes, it serves not only for light, but it can become the willing servants of the family in countless ways. It can relieve the drudgery of the housewife and lift the great burden off the shoulders of the hard-working farmer. And so today, I think that high-speed internet is also a necessity, but like in the 1930s, many rural people are missing out. And Norris believed fundamentally that government, not business, must provide a solution for necessities. He wrote, "A free people cannot permanently submit to the private monopoly a necessity of life." It's a core belief. And Norris felt that the REA was a step that would extend the blessings of electricity throughout the nation. So that's what he wanted the government program to do that. And the REA program really was successful. By 1943, 466 million had been lent by the REA for electric power infrastructure. They had built 380,000 miles of power lines, and over 1 million new consumers were receiving electricity. The REA ultimately helped the percentage of electrified farms in the United States rise from the 10% in 1935, 50% by 1945, 97% by 1960. So Norris's solution really worked for the nation. And so in October of 2019, Nebraska's Rural Broadband Task Force made 35 recommendations to improve broadband access for rural Nebraskans. And they really are all good ideas. If you're interested in broadband, you can go to ruralbroadband.nebraska.gov and you can see all the work they've done. You can see this great report from 2019. However, I don't think that Norris would be satisfied with this. I don't think he would say, oh, that's good, thanks, 35 recommendations, let's go. I think he'd be pushing for something much larger than an incremental plan for Nebraska. He would want a national solution. And he would argue that providing comprehensive and inexpensive broadband service is not a task that private industry can, or cares to, take on. And so he'd see that the urgency of our pandemic-fueled connectivity crisis that we're going through right now could be the opportunity that he could use to bring rural access to everybody, regardless of where you live. And so I am not really sure if Norris today, in 2020, if he'd advocate for the same solution that he did in the 1930s, like co-ops, like the REA, or if he proposed something new, but I am convinced that he would still believe that a free people cannot permanently submit to the private monopoly, a necessity of life. He'd look for a government solution that was not dependent on the goodwill of corporations. And I think that's what he'd be focused on today. But the thing that I love most about George Norris, and I'm glad we've got some younger people that are here today as well, was that he was not brilliant. George Norris was not a genius. And I think that's really important to note. He wasn't the greatest speaker. He wasn't the greatest writer. He wasn't the greatest fundraiser. He wasn't the greatest at any of those things. He had talents, but his talents were a commitment to a principle, a belief, an idea that was larger than himself, and then he followed that up with absolutely dogged persistence. That was his superpower, persistence, not brilliance. He'd see the lack of broadband access in Nebraska and America as inequitable and detrimental to providing opportunities for prosperity for rural people. And if he were alive today, he'd see that as a problem, so he'd walk to his house, he'd sit in a chair, he'd start talking to experts, he'd study the issue intently for a long time, and then he'd walk out that front door again, and he'd get to work to craft legislation that would provide a solution. And it really wouldn't matter to Norris that if it was unpopular. It wouldn't matter if any of us liked his solution. He wouldn't care. It wouldn't matter if it took him 10 years to get it done. It took him 12 years to do TVA. He did not quit. He'd see it as the right thing to do, and absolutely nothing would get in this man's way. And for me, that's like the largest lesson that Norris can teach us about 2020. I think it's easy enough to convince ourselves that we're small, we're one individual, we're not good enough to fight for a solution to a problem. The problem is too big for us. Someone else should do it. Somebody else should step forward, not me. But George Norris, I think he fundamentally understood that the world is changed by those who show up. People that show up are the ones who change the world. And so he showed up. My lesson from Norris is that you don't have to be brilliant, but you have to believe in something bigger than yourself, and you have to keep at it. So if you're sitting here and you're thinking, well, there's something I want to make better in this community, in my community, in the state, the nation, the world, take a page for George Norris's playbook, decide what that larger thing is, and then keep working at it. Remember that George Norris, I think it's easy to think about this now, but George Norris was not always popular. He was actually very unpopular for much of his career, and he took a lot of crap for his decisions. This is a man who voted for us not to go into World War I when he was overwhelming. It was like him and a couple other people. This is a man who believed so much in a principle, he was willing to switch his party when he felt his party no longer embodied those principles. He believed in things. So he always faced strong opposition to his ideas, but what he really cared about was making the United States a better and more prosperous place for all Americans. And he was willing to work to make our nation a better place. And I think if he were here in 2020, he'd expect us to do the same. And his words for us would be, What are you doing to get through this year? So thank you. That's what I have to say about George Norris.
Thank you, Trevor. We really appreciate you coming out here today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alexis Quint. She's going to sing us one more song, and then we will make our closing remarks for the morning.
West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River. Life is old there, older than the trees, younger than the mountains, growing like a breeze. Country roads take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, mountain mama, take me home. Country roads, all my memories gather round her. Honest lady, stranger to the water. Dark and dusty, painted on the sky. Whiskey taste and moonshine, teardrop in my eye. Country roads take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, mountain mama, take me home. Country roads, I hear her voice in the morning. Now she calls me. The radio reminds me of my home far away. Driving down the road, I get a feeling that I should have been home yesterday. Yesterday, country roads take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, mountain mama, take me home. Country roads, country roads, take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, mountain mama, take me home. Country roads, take me home. Down country roads, down country roads.
I do want to quickly thank a few of our special guests that have come. I do see Mike Gonzalez, Mark Harpham, and Nate Snyder, all from the City of McCook, and a few other City of McCook staff members. Thank you all for coming and supporting this event. Colin Suda and his crew from Southwest Public Power District, they're always here to support us. They promote what Norris wanted, and we are grateful for all the work you guys do. We do have some royalty with us. I will start with the king, I think, had to leave. I apologize, Angie. Alec Langan, the queen, Miss Emily Schendel, Prince Owen Smith, also Prince Baylor Winters. Our honor family this year, as we all know, very well deserving of it. Matt and Shelley Sainer. And our Grand Marshal this year, Mr. Dennis Berry. So every year, I try and put a quote on our program that I think means something. Let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Let us not seek to fix the blame for the past. Let us accept our own responsibility for the future. Today, I think that is more important than ever, that we keep pushing for the right answer. Go with what George said, the unicameral. I remember talking to Tom Vickers when I first joined the Norris Institute and Foundation, and he said, it's not about what the Republicans want or what the Democrats want. It's about if you can sleep with the decisions you made that day. He held me to a higher standard of knowing what's important in life. And I thank you for that, Tom. I think a lot of people could learn from you. I appreciate all the hard work that the Norris Institute Board does to put this event on. Our president, Cloyd Clark, Vice President. Mark Graff is always helping out as treasurer. I'm Maggie Repass, I'm the secretary. Warren Jones has busted his butt to get that Norris car outside ready, and we are so grateful to him. Bruce Hoffman and Common Sense did our table decorations this year, and they're going to take them up to the Norris House so that the Norris House can look great through Heritage Days. Leon Coolin keeps me on track all the time. Dennis Berry is always supportive. Anything I need, I can always ask. Same with Bryant Brooks, Bruce McDowell, and as we all know, Donna, as Trevor said, you do such a wonderful job with the Norris House. I thank you all for coming this morning. I hope you have a wonderful day. Enjoy Heritage Days. I look forward to seeing you all at the parade tomorrow and in the park throughout the weekend. Thank you so much for coming.